International news now.
No time for that.
No time for that. All right, so we're going to start the conversation by trying to define what has been called the border crisis in policy debates over the last few years. Trump clearly campaigned on a policy program that was oriented around trying to solve this crisis, which included tightening the enforcement of border regulations to reduce the flow of people into the United States and to reduce transnational criminal activity associated with the movement of people across U.S. territorial borders. So we're going to begin this outline and of the policy debate that obviously had big implications for the elections with a quick video clip from CBS News that was put together, and this is important, in February of last year, in February of 2024. So let's go ahead and run that clip.
Does the U.S. have a border crisis? Yeah.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
Migrants gasping for air from a truck in Frio County, Texas.
Everybody's looking for something better. We're not animals, we're human beings.
Our country is being poisoned.
The buses keep coming to New York City and Washington, D.C.
New York City is a self-declared sanctuary city.
Republicans are playing politics with human beings, using them as props.
This issue will destroy New York City.
Texas has been left alone as some frontier outpost.
Biden is simply derelict in his duty.
Border, border, border. To secure our own border before we talk about doing anything else.
It has consumed American politics for years, and this year, an election year, it's everything. But this crisis is almost two crises, depending on where you sit politically. Some see it as an invasion.
An invasion.
A big surge of potentially bad people, they say. Drug dealers, those who don't belong. The other side believes the crisis is humanitarian, where bad things happen to desperate people.
Tonight, the drowning of 3 migrants, a woman and 2 children, escalating tensions between the White House and the state of Texas.
Somewhere between these two realities is what both sides agree is a truly broken system, where even those who get in will, in many cases, be ordered to leave the U.S. at the end of a complicated, confusing court process that can take years.
The situations are so risky and so complicated for them that they can no longer wait. And sometimes they decide to risk it all.
So let's try to understand what the U.S. border crisis actually is, starting with the raw numbers. So anyone who tells you how many migrants cross illegally into the U.S. each year is guessing, because no one has that number. Best we can do is look at how often U.S. Border Patrol catches people trying to cross. Donald Trump's first year in office, 2017, he gets tough on border security, orders a wall, hires thousands more Border Patrol agents, pours money into detention facilities. And that year, apprehensions are at historic lows, just over 300,000, which maybe still sounds like a lot because that's almost 1,000 people a day just getting caught trying to get in. But the numbers get bigger. 2018, just over 400,000 apprehensions. The year after, 859,000. This is still while Trump is president. 2020 was a funny year, the start of the pandemic. The start of lockdowns worldwide, people moved less, and the U.S. tightened its border. But a year later, Joe Biden's first year in office, the number of migrants trying to cross explodes. 1.6 million apprehensions. The year after, 2.2 million. 2023 still hovered at around 2 million apprehensions, but 2024 is on pace to smash all previous records. And everyone knows the problem isn't going away.
The border is the worst it's ever been. You see millions and millions of people coming across the border illegally. We don't know where they come from.
I've been clear from the very beginning, the system is broken.
All right, we want to highlight 3 things from this clip. The first identifies some elements of the border crisis, how it is talked about publicly, and then how it is framed in political debates. And there's a huge difference that is partisan-based, right? Republicans describe it as an invasion and emphasize all the attendant criminal and national security risks associated with illicit activities at the border. Moreover, during the campaign last year, Republicans identified addressing the problems associated with the dramatic increase in border crossings as their number one policy priority. And we can see that in Speaker Johnson's quote that it is about the border, right? And that the United States needs to secure the border before it does anything else, okay? Note also that this crisis of the border has diffused from border states like California, New Mexico, Arizona, and most importantly, Texas. Politicians in New York City now are talking about it. And as we will discuss in just a bit, one of the reasons for this is because of efforts by the state of Texas officials to externalize the cost of the border crisis onto other states in the U.S. because Texas officials were frustrated with what they describe as the limited response by federal officials under the Biden administration. Now, this diffusion of the border crisis to the interior of the United States is important because it helps us understand why the issue is a national one rather than just a regional one confined to southern border states. Second, we can clearly see the partisan elements of this debate. The clip that we just saw reinforces them by showing how Democrats and Republicans talk about the border crisis in different ways. The Republicans call it an invasion and a national security threat. The Democrats emphasize the ongoing humanitarian tragedy associated with the rush of people making dangerous efforts to cross the border, sometimes at the risk of their own lives, and also what that implied about the push factors in their home countries, namely that these immigrants would risk death during the travel up to and across the southern border of the United States because things were so bad or dangerous in their home countries.
Third, we want to reinforce the numbers that are presented in the clip to help you understand the trends behind the border crisis and give you some updates in those trends that the clip doesn't discuss because of its production date in February of 2024. So this slide now provides data on the number of Border Patrol encounters from 1980 to 2023. People attempting to cross the border are detained in these instances. And this data includes three categories, okay? An apprehension in which the person may or may not be arrested because they have requested political asylum. Second is a person who is classified as inadmissible according to Title VIII immigration provisions. That's the legal code governing immigration. So these are people who are classified as inadmissible according to Title VIII immigration provisions and thus subject to immediate deportation. But some of this group might be later eligible to apply for humanitarian protection or political asylum. And then the third group is expulsions, or which were people who were denied entry under Title 42, which allows the government to expel people and not because of public health risks, and the people in this category cannot apply for asylum in this third category. So the pink coloring in this table that you see here combines the apprehension and inadmissible categories. And a couple things stand out in the data. First, note the continuity in encounter trends during the Obama and Trump administrations. Right? They suggest that illegal border crossings were at 45-year lows during those two presidencies. Moreover, note that deportations, we don't have this data here, but deportations were also very high during the Obama administration, particularly in his second term. Now, second, we see significant growth in Border Patrol encounters during the Biden administration. This large growth in encounters tells us something about why the political discourse in the United States changed towards the focus on the border crisis.
Okay, so next we want to give you a bit more data that updates where the video left off. The far right portion of the next slide gives us data on the first 6 months of 2024. This contradicts the expected trend highlighted in the video. Border detentions began to drop significantly in 2024 relative to the historic highs at the end of 2023. And now this is important relative to the politics of the border in the presidential campaign. It suggests that the Biden administration began to slow the record number of crossings, but that it didn't do a good job of communicating these policy changes to voters, and it didn't make these changes fast enough, arguably. Okay, now we want to run a second clip from this video, and it helps us to understand the unique role of the state of Texas in the politics of border enforcement. And it helps us understand how Governor Greg Abbott's policies help to make border enforcement a national issue. So let's run that clip now.
Texas Governor Greg Abbott believes the federal government has failed Texas, hung it out to dry, and that his state is under attack.
Texas has been left alone as some frontier outpost for us to have to grapple with ourselves the record-breaking volume of millions of people coming across the border a year. Jake, if this is not an invasion, what is?
In 2021, he launched Operation Lone Star, which was the state's way of tackling a national problem. You see, normally, immigration is a federal issue. States themselves don't enforce immigration law. But issuing dozens of local disaster declarations allowed the governor to redeploy the Texas National Guard. That's military. Destination, the Mexico border.
Governor Abbott asserted the state's right to self-defense today along the southern border. He actually doubled down on what he's called an invasion.
The very latest on the border right now, the crisis and a standoff over the use of razor wire.
Abbott has called this line of defense the steel curtain. When Lone Star first launched, 500 National Guard soldiers early in the year became 10,000 by the end of it, when you also count state police that were also diverted to Border Patrol. Often, the law they're enforcing is trespassing, but they also target suspected drug smugglers and human traffickers. In a news release earlier this year, Texas claimed 38,300 criminal arrests with over 453 million lethal doses of fentanyl seized in the last 3 years. And the headline of that same news release, Texas transports over 100,000 migrants to sanctuary cities. That's where a Texas problem became everyone's problem.
We have shouldered this course far too long. This is decimating the foundation of our city. It will undermine our city.
New York is an example of a so-called sanctuary city, which is basically any city that goes out of its way to protect undocumented migrants. Sometimes that can be a don't ask, don't tell policy when police officers stop people. Sometimes it's providing services in spite of a person's immigration status. And sometimes it's just complete non-cooperation with federal immigration officials. Point being, the state of Texas targeted New York City, literally putting migrants on buses and driving them across the country. Within less than 2 years, more than 37,000 were sent to New York City, more than 30,000 to Chicago. Denver, Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, Los Angeles all received thousands.
This is a political stunt by Governor Abbott. He's unfortunately using human beings as political pawns.
New York's mayor said the migrant crisis would destroy his city. In Chicago, last month, they resorted to packing migrants into buses just to keep them from freezing.
Wow. So let's highlight a couple of things from this clip. First, we see the central role played by Texas and Texas politics in questions about how the southern border should be regulated. The geographic location of the state places it at the center of this controversy. And Governor Abbott has staked out a political position that elevates security concerns by describing the record number of crossings as an invasion. Second, Abbott devised new ways to challenge what he would describe as federal inaction in dealing with these policy challenges. He issued a series of emergency declarations to assert greater state control over what has typically been regarded as a federal responsibility, namely border policing.
I think we should pause and just reiterate the escalation that happened by this move by the Texas state government. I mean, from 500 to 10,000 Border Patrol personnel. I mean, that's a huge ramp up.
It's a huge ramp up, but also note that there had been an extensive court conflict between the state and the federal government over who has the right to implement these policies.
And the Texas state usually lost in those court cases. So,
So third and related, this dispute between state and federal officials illustrates a deeper distributional conflict in the United States over which states should pay the costs, both in terms of crime, law enforcement, and of growing demand on public services for the population growth associated with higher immigration flows. Abbott's busing policies were designed in part to distribute some of these costs away from Texans and toward more other geographically distant cities. And we can see in the final part of this clip that this redistribution created significant problems in cities like New York City and Chicago by stressing public and private resources there. Again, this geographic diffusion of the costs of these border crossings help us to understand why the border crisis became such a nationally prominent issue.
Okay, in the second part of this lecture, we want to build out our data presentation a bit more. And we're going to move from talking about trends in unauthorized entries over the past 5 or 6 years. And we want to begin here with how the United States government, specifically the Department of Homeland Security, defines legal residents and unauthorized immigrants. Okay, so a legal foreign-born resident includes naturalized citizens, children who have derived citizenship from one or more parents, persons granted lawful permanent residence, persons granted asylum, persons admitted as refugees, persons admitted as resident non-immigrants, those are like students and temporary workers who have unexpired authorized periods of admission, okay? So those are legal residents. The unauthorized immigrants are foreign-born non-citizens who are not legal residents. And according to government statistics, this group includes people with temporary protected status, people with DACA status, and DACA refers to the policy Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or other forms of prosecutorial discretion, so they're allowed to stay here. Those awaiting a ruling by an immigration court, unauthorized people with pending requests for lawful permanent residence, and humanitarian paroles. Now note that the popular discourse often refers to the group of unauthorized or of unauthorized residents as illegals or illegal aliens. Now, it's important to note that this is not really correct because many of these unauthorized residents have some form of temporary legal status. They don't, however, hold permanent authorized status, and that's the key distinction. Now, given this definition, how has this population of unauthorized immigrants in the United States changed? And what is the role of that population in the border crisis? That's what we're going to go into next.
And the first thing here I want is to separate the population of unauthorized individuals from the rise of people crossing into the United States via border encounters during the Biden administration. And this is important because many of the people who entered the U.S. during the Biden presidency, particularly in the last 2.5 years, were granted temporary permission to be here. So they are here legally. The president had the legal authority to grant them that status through congressional statutes. However, President Trump disagreed with those policies and wants to deport many of those people that were given temporary status by the Biden administration, along with many people that are in the broader category of undocumented, unauthorized, or illegal. So let's start talking about the data then and look at estimates of unauthorized people in the United States. And we're going to start with some data from the Pew Research Center. And this data closely resembles data that was published in an April 2024 study by the Department of Homeland Security. And it's important to remember, as the video said, that these are estimates. But these two studies estimated that there were about 11 million unauthorized people living in the United States at the end of 2022. And let's look at the long-term trends here in these numbers. These numbers rapidly increased over the period from 1990 to 2008. Then they fell during the Obama and Trump presidencies, before increasing by 5 to 10% during the first year and a half of the Trump administration, of the Biden administration. We're going to see how they grew substantially more than that in 2023 and 2024 in a second, right? But more broadly, this data suggests that this portion of the US population of unauthorized residents has been fairly stable over a 15-year period from, say, about 2010 to 2022. Okay, so if the number of unauthorized people hasn't changed radically over the past 15 years, up until 2023 and 24, and we'll show you that in a second, then why are we talking about a border crisis?
Okay, so here we need to return to the significant growth in the number of border encounters during the Biden presidency. Many of them hold different types of legal status that leaves them at least temporarily protected from deportation. Remember that the government includes in the unauthorized group people who are waiting for some final legal judgment on their status of residency in the country. The number of unauthorized people in the United States appears to have swelled from about 11 million in 2022 to about 14 million at the end of 2024. So this expansion of 3 million people in such a short period of time is really what sort of generated this border crisis. This entire block of people, though, is not illegal because about 40% or 5.5 million of them have some temporary legal authorization to be here. So to characterize them as all illegal entrants is just not accurate. And we see much of the growth of this unauthorized population during the final 2 years of the Biden presidency. In this proportion of the unauthorized residents is the temporary permission status. Many of President Trump's executive orders on immigration target this group of people with temporary permission, or at least eliminates any growth in this population. Let's work through each of these temporary authorization programs right now. So first, we have DACA, or the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. This group is also sometimes referred to as the Dreamers, right? And it grants temporary legal residence in the United States to people who were in the United States on June 5th, 2012, and were brought to the United States as children by parents who the government would otherwise classify as unauthorized. Now, this group, the DACA group, make up about 550,000 of the total number of unauthorized people in the United States. And it's important to note that President Trump has signaled his willingness to allow this group to remain in the United States. Now, the second group to highlight here is the Temporary Protected Status Group. And this is a program whereby the Secretary of Homeland Security can designate people from specific foreign countries with TPS, Temporary Protective Status, because conditions such as war or an environmental disaster in the country temporarily prevented the nationals from returning to their home countries safely. And Congress passed the laws creating this program in 1990. People with TPS status cannot be deported and can secure work authorization for some fixed period of time, often 2 years. So as the figure notes, about 1.1 million of the 14 million whole group of unauthorized hold this TPS status. Now, currently there are 17 TPS countries. So President Biden, right before he left office on January 10th, 2025, he extended TPS status for people from Ukraine, Sudan, and Venezuela into 2026. And he did this to protect them from deportation by President Trump. And so as the figure notes, some of the largest groups with this status include people from Ukraine, Afghanistan, Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela.
All right, so third and this people with temporary status are people in a new program during the Biden administration, which was called the CBP-1 program. So the Biden administration created this program. I mean, the app itself was created in 2020, but in 2023, they started using the app to alleviate significant crowding at the US-Mexico border that was forcing the Border Patrol to close some ports of entry because they needed to divert staff to high-volume crossing areas. So this was designed to alleviate traffic at the border. So what is CBP-1? It's a mobile app that allowed, we have to use the past tense now, that allowed individuals, principally in Mexico, to schedule an appointment to present themselves for entry into the United States at one of the 8 primary entry ports along the southern border, so that then they could apply for political asylum at the time of their entry. This became the only way that people could request political asylum in the United States. By August of 2023, and it was designed to make this more efficient and safe, the border crossing process. By August of 2023, Customs and Border Protection was processing about 1,500 such applications per day in the United States. In many cases, after people made their initial asylum request, when they crossed at a specific border point, they were then granted parole in the United States for up to 2 years, and they could work during that program. So about 1 million people gained entry into the United States in 2023 and 2024 through this CBP-1 program. It's important to note that the Trump administration halted the program within an hour of him taking the oath of office on January 20th, 2025, and canceled all remaining appointments for people to enter the United States and request political asylum through that mobile app.
Yeah. And so the fourth group of unauthorized migrants is made up of people that have presented themselves for asylum at the border and are awaiting a ruling by an immigration court in the United States. Now, the first thing to note here is the definition of political asylum. So what is political asylum? This is a program whereby individuals secure legal residency rights in the United States because they fear political persecution or harm in their home countries. Asylum seekers are granted entry into the U.S. via a different program than refugees fleeing a war might enter. So people who are granted asylum also gain work authorization. Now, there is a huge backlog in immigration courts to hear these asylum cases. About 2.5 million people in the United States are classified as unauthorized because they are waiting for their asylum claim to be heard and decided by an immigration judge. The average wait time to have an asylum case heard and decided is now about 5 years.
So the fifth group of unauthorized immigrants include people that were granted some form of humanitarian parole by President Biden. President Biden expanded this program for people from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela in 2023. And then they used their entry and they tracked their entry through the CBP-1 mobile app. And so people could fill out their entry application form in CBP-1 and then from these countries, and then they could fly into the United States. About 530,000 people from these 4 countries entered in 2023 and 2024. President Biden also allowed Ukrainians and Afghans to enter the United States through this humanitarian parole program as well. Okay, so we want to do 2 more things here as a means of summarizing these recent trends in immigration that has motivated a larger part of the national conversation about a border crisis. And we want to look at the data in different ways to see which groups might be most affected by changes in Trump administration policy. First, as we talk about in the next section, President Trump issued a series of executive orders that halted the policies of the Biden administration that had increased the number of people with temporary permission to be here in the United States, largely in the last 2.5 years of his administration. Thus, the numbers of these groups in the darker green circle on the left-hand side of this slide, they're not going to increase anymore during the Trump administration. And as their terms expire, so Biden let them in under fixed terms, say 18 months or 2 years. As their terms expire, the administration will likely target them to be deported. And as a side note on this, President Biden on January 10th intentionally, and we just mentioned this, expanded the term for many of these people that had been granted humanitarian parole to give them more time in the United States because they expected them to be the target of deportation by the Trump administration as soon as it came into the office. Okay, so more broadly, we should expect to see these numbers, right, of unauthorized people with temporary permission to steadily fall during the Trump presidency. Second, while the Trump administration has talked about prioritizing the deportation of the worst criminals first, it has also simultaneously said that people here without legal status are also subject to deportation and are illegals. So the next slide is going to give you a sense of what that might mean for many of the 8.5 million people in that light green circle there that are in that circle that don't have any legal status. And so this next slide is going to give us data that draws from that 2024 study that I mentioned earlier. It estimates the number of unauthorized people in the US in 2022 at 11 million people before we had this explosion in the last 2 years of the Biden administration. Moreover, it disaggregates this 11 million people by estimating their period of entry. So it indicates how long some groups of unauthorized people have been in the United States. Note here that of the 11 million unauthorized people in 2022, nearly 78% of them had entered the country before 2010. This means that large chunks of the people without any legal status will have been long-term residents of the United States, like the Dreamers. Now, this suggests that their deportation could be extremely disruptive to their families and the communities in which they have long been embedded.
All right, in this final section, in the final section of the course, so later in the semester, we are going to...
Right now, sorry.
No, in the finals, okay, so in this, okay. Right, got it, okay, right. Okay, so in the final segment of this lecture, we are returning to immigration policy so we can identify the changes that President Trump has implemented via executive order since taking office, and they are significant. So these are the changes that have happened in the last 2 weeks. Right. These executive orders issued a national emergency at the border. So they allocated Defense Department resources to aid border construction of barriers, walls, etc., and to surge U.S. troops there. They halted the Biden administration's programs that increased the flow of unauthorized immigrants into the United States in the last 2 years of the Biden presidency. And so they have dramatically increased also the pace of deportations. So they are reducing and shutting off all the programs that led to the surge in the last 2 years of the Biden presidency, and they're also pushing out some people who are here. President Trump announced plans to build detention facilities for deportees at Guantanamo Bay. And President Trump issued a particularly controversial executive order that tries to eliminate the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution that guarantees birthright citizenship. So we're going to talk about all of these changes shortly, but we want to begin with an overview clip of these policy changes from National Public Radio. It's an audio clip, so let's run that now.
Among the Trump administration's series of sweeping actions this week is a crackdown on illegal immigration, one of the president's campaign promises. President Trump is sending 1,500 active duty troops to the border and ending Biden-era border and asylum policies. Not all of his executive orders will have immediate effects, but immigration experts say that taken together, they lay out a blueprint for how Trump aims to dramatically transform enforcement at the border and beyond. NPR's Joel Rose reports.
From his first moments in office, President Trump framed the problem of illegal immigration in terms of national security.
And I will send troops to the southern border to repel the disastrous invasion of our country.
That word, invasion, has become mainstream on the right when talking about immigration, despite objections from immigrant advocates and some Democrats who say it's dehumanizing and deeply misleading since border crossings have come down from their record highs. But the Trump administration is leaning into it. The The word invasion appears frequently in the executive orders he signed this week. It's in the title of 2 of them, and there may be a very specific legal reason.
I was not surprised to hear it at all. I think that was intended to tee up some of the actions he's contemplating now.
Elizabeth Goitein is a legal expert with the Brennan Center for Justice, a left-leaning nonprofit.
It's been widely understood that the president has inherent constitutional authority to repel sudden attacks or invasions. So these are terms that summon essentially war powers.
The Trump administration is already using this justification to effectively cut off access to asylum at the southern border. There's another option that the president has talked about using to go after drug cartels, the Alien Enemies Act, which would give him emergency authority to bypass normal immigration law, to quickly detain and deport non-citizens. Goitein says it's only been used a few times, most recently during World War II.
It's quite clear that the framers understood the term to deal with armed attacks by foreign powers. We're talking about acts of war. We are not talking about unlawful immigration.
It's not clear if the Trump administration's invasion theory will work in the courts. A federal judge in Texas has already ruled against that state's leaders when they tried to make a similar case. But if Trump's executive orders do hold up, they could help his administration reshape the immigration system, and not just at the border. John Sandweg was acting director of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement under President Obama.
If you look at these executive orders, it really is all spelled out there. And this is exactly where they're going.
Sandweg was skeptical that Trump could deliver on his campaign promise to build the largest mass deportation operation in U.S. history. That's mainly because of legal and logistical hurdles, including a shortage of detention beds and long backlogs in immigration court. But after looking at this week's executive orders, Sandweg says his thinking has changed. He says the White House could tap military resources and the Alien Enemies Act to speed things up.
If he is able to bypass those courts entirely and then tap into Department of Defense resources and build detention camps and military bases, mass deportation becomes a much more realistic possibility.
Another Trump order has directed the Defense Department to draw up a plan for, quote, sealing the borders. That would go far beyond what any recent administration has done there. For now, Trump is only moving 1,500 active duty troops to the border, and their role is limited to building border barriers and operating flights to send 5,000 migrants a month back to their home countries.
And this is all perfectly legal.
Mark Krikorian is with the Center for Immigration Studies, a think tank that favors lower levels of immigration. He says Trump may try to test the boundaries by using active duty troops to assist directly in immigration enforcement.
Will soldiers be arresting illegal aliens? That'll be an interesting question.
One of many questions as President Trump follows through on the blueprint he laid out this week. Joel Rose, NPR News, Washington.
Okay. So we want to highlight a few things from this clip. First, it reinforces a similar framing of the internal political conflict over the border between Democrats and Republicans. Democrats want to focus on the humanitarian challenges associated with the dramatic growth in asylum requests, and Republicans want to classify these demographic changes in terms of an invasion that threatens the national security of the United States. Now, second, it also notes what could be underlying political and legal strategies behind this discussion of an invasion. An invasion evokes national security concerns, and the president has clear constitutional authority to take broad actions to repel an invasion. So this rhetoric could be consistent with a broader legal strategy that relies on executive authority to devise new and potentially more drastic policy responses without securing the consent of Congress. And it is important to note that presidents have wide authority to regulate immigration flows on their own through executive orders. And so historically, the president has a lot of power in this issue area. And just as President Biden used this executive authority to expand temporary authorizations in the final 2.5 years of his presidency, President Trump can halt those authorizations and decrease the number of immigrants coming into the United States. And that's what he's doing. And he's committed to that dramatic decrease in allowing any immigrants in, but also a dramatic increase in deportations. Now, third, note the comments from the former Obama administration official in the clip. It indicated some surprise at how organizationally effective the Trump administration has been at instituting these significant changes to immigration policy in such a short period of time. It has used executive orders to free resources by diverting them from the Defense Department. And its reversals of prior executive orders and creative uses of things like declaring criminal cartels as foreign terrorist organizations can create the legal means to bypass backlogged immigration courts in order to hasten deportations.
So next, we want to get into more detail on policy changes, particularly with respect to the executive orders on immigration. And as a sidebar, we'll focus our discussion on the executive orders that we didn't discuss last week, just briefly mentioning those that we already did. And we want to couple these policy changes with the data that we presented in the prior section of the lecture. And so keep that data in the back of your mind while we're working through each of these. So first, Trump issued a proclamation declaring a national emergency at the border. As we discussed earlier, this appears to provide legal foundation to invoke presidential authority to close the border. And that proclamation stated it's necessary for the armed forces to have all appropriate action to assist the Department of Homeland Security in obtaining full operational control of the southern border, to protect the security and safety of the United States citizens, to protect each of the states against invasion, and to uphold my duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. It is my responsibility as president to ensure that the illegal entry of aliens into the United States via the southern border be immediately and entirely stopped. Okay. Second, President Trump issued an executive order directing the Secretary of Defense to assign the U.S. Northern Command the mission, quote, to seal the borders and maintain the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and security of the United States by repelling forms of invasion, including unlawful mass migration, narcotics trafficking, human smuggling and trafficking, and other criminal activities.
Third, the president issued an executive order to indefinitely halt the admission of refugees under the U.S. Refugees Admission Program. The executive order states that entry of refugees under the USRAP would be detrimental to the interests of the United States. Now, to give you a sense of the scope of these changes, the U.S. has allowed in 3.6 million refugees over the 50-year period from 1975 to 2024, and it granted entry of about 130,000 refugees in 2023 and 2024.
And so those are stopping.
So, yeah, and that's just going to end. Yeah. Now, fourth, in a broad executive order titled Securing Our Borders, President Trump undid many of the policies enacted by the Biden administration that granted some form of temporary status to immigrants seeking to gain entry into the United States. So this executive order directed the Defense Department to increase border fortifications, to deploy more personnel to the southern border, to eliminate catch and release, whereby people, principally families, children, and those seeking asylum, were previously granted temporary status while they waited for immigration hearings. And it reinstituted the policy of remain in Mexico, whereby people needed to remain in Mexico while their asylum claims are processed. And as a sidebar, remember that immigration courts have a backlog of up to 5 years to hear these cases. And it also ended the use of CBP1, which is that app that allows immigrants to make appointments at ports of entry, and they canceled all the existing appointments. They also terminated humanitarian parole programs, specifically those targeted to aid people from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And fifth, as we discussed last week, Trump issued an executive order to classify drug cartels as terrorist organizations. And now the intent here is to dramatically increase the speed by which non-residents with suspected ties to cartels can be deported. And then sixth, he issued an executive order that is designed to penalize sanctuary cities by withholding federal funds. Again, sanctuary cities are those that resist or obstruct federal enforcement efforts to deport unauthorized residents. So that's a lot of policies.
That's a lot. And we want to spend a little bit more time on another executive order that's titled, quote, protecting the meaning and value of American citizenship. And while this this is the birthright citizenship, while the executive order acknowledges the text of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, it reinterprets that amendment in a way that most legal scholars hold as unconstitutional. And within 3 days of this executive order, a federal judge in Washington temporarily blocked its implementation and called the order, quote, blatantly unconstitutional. And so first, let's briefly review the text of Section 1 of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, again, that this executive order is trying to undo. So the text is, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States. This is birthright citizenship. So they are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Now, the Trump executive order takes issue with the clause and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, and argues that this amendment should not apply to children of parents who were unlawfully present in the United States when they were born. So more broadly, the executive order is designed to deny citizenship to all children born inside the United States to unauthorized migrants that happen to be present in the United States. Now, constitutional scholars have held that this clause, is subject to the jurisdiction thereof, refers to and excludes people in extraterritorial jurisdictions in the United States. This is foreign embassies. So like the foreign embassy of China in Washington, D.C. But it's important to note that the executive order goes even further than that, saying that people not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States include lawful but temporary residents. So like people here on student, work, and tourist visas. So imagine people here on work visas, they have children while they're here. According to this interpretation in the executive order, their children will no longer be granted birthright citizenship, okay? So why is this such a big deal? We want to watch a video clip here from CBS News that underscores the importance of this executive order that, again, there's already a temporary injunction by a federal judge calling it unconstitutional. But let's go ahead and roll that clip.
President Trump's executive order ending birthright citizenship is on temporary hold after a federal judge last week called it blatantly unconstitutional. Birthright citizenship derives from Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, which reads in part, quote, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Vice President J.D. Vance defended the executive order on Face the Nation.
If you come here on vacation and you have a baby in an American hospital, that baby doesn't become an American citizen. If you're an illegal alien and you come here temporarily, hopefully, your child does not become an American citizen by virtue of just having been born on American soil.
Amanda Frost joins me now. She's a professor at the University of Virginia School of Law, director of the school's Immigration, Migration, and Human Rights program. Thank you for being here. Can you take us back? What was the intention behind passing the 14th Amendment, specifically this part about birthright citizenship?
Yeah, the goals were very clear of the Reconstruction Congress and the nation. This was shortly after the Civil War, and Congress's first goal was to overrule the infamous Dred Scott decision, in which the Supreme Court held that no Black person, whether they were free or slave, could ever be a U.S. citizen. So that was clearly the first and primary goal. But the secondary goal, and they talked about this in the legislative history, was they wanted to integrate the children of immigrants. They knew America was a nation of immigrants, more were arriving, and they explicitly said, we want the children of immigrants to be equal citizens and equal Americans.
Is birthright citizenship unique to the United States?
No. Other countries have birthright citizenship. We're one of 33 with pure birthright citizenship rules. Other countries have some conditions or qualifications on it, so we're not alone. Canada and Mexico also have birthright citizenship.
If birthright citizenship were to be overturned, what would happen to the newborn children of undocumented parents?
Yeah, I mean, that's the really extraordinary point. And I should add, it's not just undocumented parents. The executive order applies to the children of lawful immigrants as well, who are here temporarily on student visas or work visas. So it would be a huge number of people that would overnight become undocumented immigrants. We could expect, hundreds of thousands of children born every year to be undocumented. They wouldn't be able to get Social Security numbers. They wouldn't be able to get passports. They wouldn't have any legal right to remain in the U.S., even if their parents did. So the results of this would be extraordinary. And let me add, it wouldn't just be immigrants who would be affected. A U.S. citizen born in this country, whose parents and grandparents have been here, that person who has a baby, if that executive order were in place, would also have to prove their lineage to the satisfaction of the government before their child would be recognized as a citizen.
What else do you think people should know about this?
I think what I'd love people to take from this conversation now we're having about birthright citizenship is how essential it is to who America is, to our values. We were a nation founded on the idea that we were rejecting an hereditary monarchy. We were rejecting titles of nobility. We're not about lineage. We're about location. You're here, you're one of us. And America is better than most countries at integrating the children of immigrants. Europe really struggles with that, but we do a great job with that. And this executive order and the end of birthright citizenship would put at risk something that's really a superpower of the United States.
Amanda Frost, thank you.
So I just want to highlight a couple of important things from the clip. First, the intent behind the 14th Amendment was to undo the Dred Scott decision that denied all slaves citizenship in the United States. It was about guaranteeing citizenship rights of African Americans, former slaves, and all their descendants. Accordingly, it was a foundational political component of the peace settlement that ended the Civil War. It's a big deal to talk about revising that settlement or to suggest that important parts of it are no longer necessary. Second, note what the scholar says about U.S. identity, values, and the role here of this provision in the long-term political and cultural integration of immigrants into the United States. This executive order would threaten those protections, and if upheld, would provide a strong deterrent to future immigration. Why move to the United States to work, say in the tech sector, and plan on being here for 10 or 15 years if your children may never have citizenship in the United States? So stay tuned. We expect to see updates on the legal status of this executive order. And I just told Rob, I had put together another video clip from last week that we didn't run on birthright citizenship, suggesting that in some cases the executive order was a test case, that the administration didn't think it was going to get this executive order through and that it wouldn't stand on constitutional grounds, but instead it wanted to use the executive order as a device to see what it could get away with in terms of pressing and changing immigration law under executive authority. So in a sense, as a test case to see what the legal system would tolerate with respect to executive order. All right, so final thoughts here on kind of wrapping things up. A couple things to think about, and we're going to watch this as the pace and the scale of deportations increase in the next 5-6 months. These many elements, and this is one of the reasons we want to get in the data. On the one hand, there are groups that will be easy to schedule for deportation. For other groups, it's going to be challenging and disruptive.
So let's talk about the groups that are easy to schedule for deportation. I mean, if it sticks to this whole idea of exporting, convicted criminals, that's not going to be, not going to be that hard legally to enact, nor is it going to face a lot of pushback from Democrats or parts of it's broadly popular, and it's not. The Biden administration didn't have a policy against that. I mean, that wouldn't be very controversial, right? Also, I'd say if you shut down the previous Biden administration policies, that's also something that you can enact, and as President of the United States, just like they were enacted by executive decree, you can kind of unwind them by executive decree.
And then, but also think about all the people who were brought in under and this is important, who were brought in under temporary protected status by the Biden administration, after the rush in the middle of 2022. So when these people come in, they're fingerprinted, They're registered. They list a host family or host people, and so the government has lots of data to track them. More importantly, they were given protected status for a fixed period of time, 18 months to say 24 months generally. And so when that fixed time is up, we should expect that there will be dramatic efforts to scale up the deportation of them, because their terms, all the political language and everything suggests that their terms are not going to be extended.
Yeah, and that is, again, within the confines of the process, right? I mean, when you have temporary legal status, that really means temporary unless it gets extended, and thus deporting them wouldn't be very controversial either, I would imagine. And legally, it wouldn't get there wouldn't be the kind of legal challenges to some of the other more disruptive or border, boundary challenging decrees. So those are the easy ones.
Yeah, and then we start thinking about some of the administrative challenges. So now we have, if there's anywhere between 2.5 million, and I need to be honest here, the data was a little bit unclear. The New York Times story that I gave you the graphics, it said there's 2.5 million people waiting to have their asylum cases heard. It's a little bit unclear how then you classify the people that entered under CBP 1, about 1 million of those people, whether they all are waiting to have, so there actually could be like 3.5 million people waiting to hear their asylum cases. Well, the administrative challenges here are you need to hire more judges, but we don't have administrative and budget resources to hire more judges. And so people that are waiting for their asylum claims, it's going to be, well, you can't. You have to wait to hear their asylum claims before you can deport them. So that's a big chunk of the population, right? That
this is what's important in this discussion, because in the media, there aren't these fine distinctions made, right? And so how this gets rolled out is actually going to be pretty complicated, in the sense that some of the things, like we just said, are easy, if temporary status and the like, right? But if you're here legally waiting for your asylum judgment, that's going to be really hard to deport them without doing some sort of legal jiu-jitsu to say, well, we're not going to wait. I mean, and we're going to that kind of executive order would surely get a legal challenge, and probably have a lot more trouble getting them out in any sort of quick process.
Well, and think about some of the other administrative challenges here too. So you got to hire more judges. You have to build more detention facilities if you're going to be rounding people up, because you can't automatically transfer them to their home country the next day. Instead, you need detention facilities to house them. This is why there are facilities being built at Guantanamo Bay. And then politically, you've got to get the other countries to accept people that you want to deport. And here in the last week, and we didn't have time to get through in this, we had a significant diplomatic crisis between the United States and Colombia in the last week, because Colombia said, we disagree with the humanitarian treatment of our citizens because you're flying them in shackles on military planes to Colombia. And so Colombia refused to grant landing rights to these U.S. military troop transports. And in a span of, and the president of Colombia issued this big declaration, pushback publicly on social media that then upset President Trump. And President Trump right away went to huge tariff penalties, restricting the visa status of Colombian officials in the United States, and threatening severe financial sanctions. We're talking about basically, I mean, the tariffs were going to go up to 50% on Colombian exports in the United States in a span of a week. Coffee,
flowers.
Coffee, flowers were the biggest hits. Both sides stood down in the crisis. They got a deal whereby they're going to use Colombian planes to fly deportees. The larger issue is, in terms of the administration of deportation, the execution of this, you've got to secure cooperation from other governments. And Trump has demonstrated that he's willing to use huge threats to get what he wants. And we saw in the case of Colombia that Colombia backed down pretty quickly. So more generally, I think there are going to be challenges here, but I think it would be a mistake to doubt the resolve of the Trump administration. We said this in the clip from the former Obama administration official. They're clearly organized. They clearly had a long-term plan, and they are in the early stages of executing this carefully designed administrative and political strategy to dramatically reduce the number of unauthorized individuals living in the United States. The one thing, and we didn't have, and then or did you want to jump in on this, or let me just say, one thing we didn't talk about here, and I had intended to do this and we ran out of time. Don't ignore the economic implications of massive deportations in the United States. Because one of the things to remember, everybody here with temporary status, they have the right to, or most everyone here with temporary status was also given the right to work. That expansion in the labor supply in the United States post-2022 was central into sustaining, and economists have recognized this, was central to sustaining economic growth in the aftermath of COVID. It was essential to restoring the labor supply in the service sector after lots of people decided they didn't want to work during the COVID shocks. And so it was important to controlling the acceleration of inflation in 2022. So the Federal Reserve met this week, and Chairman Powell was already asked, what about policy changes? Are you taking these into consideration when you're thinking about inflation? He said, absolutely. We have uncertainty over tariff policy and we have uncertainty over immigration policy. And there are real concerns on Wall Street and in the Federal Reserve that a dramatic contraction in the number of unauthorized people in the United States is going to lead to a contraction in the labor market, particularly in the services and construction sectors, which could re-accelerate inflation in the United States.
And that's why they're not going to cut interest rates on the same pace as they were, because they're looking forward and saying, we don't know how this is going to play out.
In the last week, private sector surveys have indicated that inflation expectations among private individuals are increasing in the United States. What does this mean? It means that Americans believe that inflation is going to increase, not decrease, over the course of 2025. And one of the reasons that these expectations are getting adjusted is because of the economic consequences of Trump administration policies. Any other?
Well, I would say my take on this is the following. What I'm going to be paying attention to is public reaction to this. So I'd say right now, so one of the things that came out this week was the first sort of snapshot of President Trump's approval ratings. And the media made a pretty big deal about his razor-thin approval versus disapproval ratings. Unlike other newly elected presidents, and that's not a very good comparison. He is newly elected, but it's because there was an interruption between his first and second term. So he's not exactly, he's more of an incumbent, right? But most newly elected presidents have more of a honeymoon period, more of a gap between their approval rating and their disapproval rating. And so if you look even at President Biden, who ended his presidency as a very unpopular president, he began his presidency in 2021 with reasonably high approval rating in the high 50% range, and but his disapproval rating was down under 20%, and so that gap was huge. What President Trump has is he's got a bit higher approval rating than he did in his first term, or just over 50%, but his disapproval rating is way up there in the 40s, and that just doesn't give him a lot of wiggle room. And so what I would say is the survey dove into some more detailed analysis of specific policies, and immigration policy is one of those areas right now where the gap is better, not worse, for him, right? There's more approval and less disapproval of the things he's doing so far. But remember, what the things he's doing so far are policies that are tightening border security, which is the most broadly supported part of the agenda, right? And it's something that the Biden administration, as we pointed out in this INN lecture, started doing, but just really pretty late, right? And so there's a lot of continuity rather than disruption. Now, there's a lot of disruption to come, I would say, and he's done it much more aggressively than Biden administration ever did. But right now, I think there's still among especially Republicans, but even that part of the Democratic Party that was like, yeah, we need to do something about all of the surge in the late Biden administration. So, but I'd say you got to watch as the issue of deportations and how many deportations and which category of unauthorized migrants are deported get center stage. That's where I think there's going to be some potential hit on his popularity here, right? I mean, especially as you say, if there's an economic consequence as well, if the price of in restaurants and groceries goes up, and the media is going to right away start pointing to restrictions on immigration. That's where I think the Trump administration is going to have some hard choices to make, because there are some checks here on President Trump, and the checks aren't from Congress, and they're not from, your typical institutional. They're in his own priorities. He won't tolerate a huge collapse of the stock market. That's just not on brand, right? I think his approval rating matters to him, and so I'm watching that, how that gets affected.
Yeah, and I would watch on inflation too.
Yeah,
right?
inflation.
What inflation?
Yeah.
And I think, and this is important, just looking at aggregate public opinion doesn't tell us the whole story, because the evidence suggests, that Trump has this very high floor, that people that never leave him, and that's been consistent over the last 7 or 8 years. But we need to think about public opinion in slightly different ways. And what Rob is talking here about is, okay, what's going on in the stock market matters, right? And so if immigration policy and trade policy create a spike in inflation expectations that then craters the stock market, my bet is we see changes in policy.
Oh, for sure.
Right? And the same thing is if inflation takes off. And so one of the things, and I'm guessing we're going to be talking about this in the next news segment, but we're filming on Friday the 31st. The administration says that we're going to have tariff increases on February the 1st from Canada and Mexico. If we get a big spike in consumer prices, I suspect we see recalibration.
Well, look, that's one of the things that you should watch all of the actions. When he froze all of the grant funding, trillions of dollars in the economy, and it started to go south, he rescinded it in a day. Now that, we've had these conversations, that was the biggest surprise to me, is how fast the rescission came.
Yeah.
And, I'm not saying that's a pattern. There are no patterns here so far. But it is an interesting thing to keep in mind when you talk about these other policy areas where it seems he has a more defined set of priorities and goals, but he also, with respect to immigration, right? But he also does still have other competing goals that might make him adjust. He's definitely willing to adjust.
Yeah, and I want to, we're talking about public opinion here. Let me just say a couple of things. So I went into a deep dive on the data this week. And I'm still, what was surprising to me, if I step back and I look at the politics of all this, I'm surprised. But it seems to me that the Trump team has a better sense of where the public was at on this issue than the Biden team was. And
that becomes unavoidably clear.
And it helps me understand what happened in the election a little bit. And I have to say that I can explain what the Biden administration was doing in terms of humanitarian concerns, in terms of economic concerns, in terms of safe administration of crossings at the border, right? And having to do that with limited resources. But what I can't explain is the inability to publicly communicate the reason for these policies to the American public and saying, yes, we have a surge, this is why we're doing it, trying to make that case. And then also not responding quicker to a clear shift in American public opinion that resisted the growth in border crossings. The Biden administration responded, but they didn't respond until February or March of 2024. And it's clearly that it cost them electorally. Yeah. And so, as a political scientist, thinking about effective political strategies and ineffective political strategies, it is striking to me the scope of the mistakes that the Biden administration made in trying to weather and manage and deal with this crisis.
And you look at the campaign, the other thing that the Trump team understood was how powerful the issue was. They wouldn't let go of the border and immigration, and Kamala Harris, and they just wanted it to go away. And that wasn't an effective strategy. Because it didn't go away, and it's not gonna.
And now we're going to see some, right?
Yeah.
As we said last time,
Somebody
elections have consequences, and we're going to see real changes.
Yeah,
right?
and this is the plan, and there's reasons for the plan, and there's arguably pros, but there are also serious cons to this plan, and we're going to find out what they are and what the limits are.
Yeah. So that's all we got for today. Thanks for hanging with us in this deep data dive. If you have questions, send us a note. Otherwise, we'll see you in a couple weeks.
2 weeks this time.
And we're not quite sure what we were talking about, but we'll let the news
We'll
the news drive the content. So have a good one.